Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about Mrs. Clay under Mr. Elliot's protection. Before we jump in, we have a couple of matters of business to cover. And we really like to say that like business with a Z, business. First of all, when this episode comes out, we will be quickly approaching 5 years of The Thing About Austen. So happy birthday to us. Woo! And thank you to all the listeners who have supported the podcast through these years. Mm-hmm. And speaking of listeners, thank you so much to everyone who signed up for our Patreon.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. We really are so grateful for all the support. So we are so excited to do our first patron shout-outs. Mm-hmm. And we debated whether we should just read everyone all at once or do like a group at a time. And we've opted for the latter since it feels more special to have your name read in a smaller group.
Yes.
So without further ado, here are our first 20 patron shout-outs.
This feels momentous.
It does.
I mean,
drum roll, please.
Kat V.
Leora Tech.
Sarah Childs.
A sympathizer of Caroline Bingley.
Then we have Kenzie.
Sarah B.
Laura C.
Madeline Petrovich.
Erica B.
Janet Laffler.
Sarah M.
To be named Sarah is to be a fan of this podcast, I think, if we've learned anything.
And we also support Sarah's.
Yes, we also support Sarah's. Claire Cormier.
Samantha Margison.
Vanessa T.
Elliot.
Ellen.
Tamara C.
Alex H.
Brianna S.
And Maria. And if we said anybody's name wrong, just DM us on Patreon and we'll
get it right.
We'll get it right in a future episode. And if we didn't read your name, you are coming in a future episode.
You're on the list.
You're on the list. So thank you again to all of our patrons. And if you would like to join our Patreon, you can head over to patreon.com/thethingaboutausten. Okay.
So now we are getting to the actual episode. We do have a bit of a heads up, both for content and for sensitive listeners. In this episode, we will be discussing the social role of mistresses and the cultural context of sex work in this time period. Because we're engaging with historical sources, you may hear period-specific derogatory terms for sex workers, but only in quotations or historical titles. We do not endorse the moral judgments historically attached to these roles, and we will do our very best to approach the topic with historical context and care. But we will be using some verbiage that we definitely wouldn't ordinarily use. And of course, if you are someone who likes to listen in the car, perhaps with your kids, just know that we will be covering some topics that you may or may not want them to hear.
So, our reference for this episode comes from the very end of Persuasion. Anne and Captain Wentworth have reconciled and are now engaged. The letter.
Letter.
Zan just passes out. She's swooning in the middle of the sidewalk. She's just fainted. And Mr. Elliot is having to reconsider his options. His plans have changed.
Yes. So here is the text. The news of his cousin Anne's engagement burst on Mr. Elliot most unexpectedly. It deranged his best plan of domestic happiness, his best hope of keeping Sir Walter single by the watchfulness which a son-in-law's rights would have given. But, though discomfited and disappointed, he could still do something for his own interest and his own enjoyment. He soon quitted Bath, and on Mrs. Clay's quitting it soon afterwards, and being next heard of as established under his protection in London, it was evident how double a game he had been playing, and how determined he was to save himself from being cut out by one artful woman at least. Mrs. Clay's affections had overpowered her interest, and she had sacrificed for the young man's sake the possibility of scheming longer for Sir Walter. She has abilities, however, as well as affections, and it is now a doubtful point whether his cunning or hers may finally carry the day, whether after preventing her from being the wife of Sir Walter, he may not be wheedled and caressed at last into making her the wife of Sir William.
Ooh, intrigue.
So much happening.
And it's really interesting at the end there how Austen switches to present tense.
Mm-hmm.
She has abilities, you know? Like, this story has not yet been written.
Mm-hmm.
Things are still happening, right? There's still things that are up in the air.
Developments are coming in, right?
Yes, exactly. This is like breaking news, basically. So if you aren't aware, when Austen uses the phrase, under his protection, she's actually euphemistically referring to the relationship between Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot in a way that would have been well understood by her audience to mean that Mrs. Clay has become Mr. Elliot's mistress. So we'll start by tracing some of the complexities of the phrase Austen uses and other terms used to reference mistresses and sex work during this period.
So, of course, we start with the OED. And so the euphemistic use of the term protection, which refers to, quote, the action of maintaining and providing for a mistress, was used as early as 1677. Around that same time, the term keeping, or, quote, the maintaining of a mistress or lover, also came into use. So Austen here is using a very well-established euphemism for a mistress.
But the term mistress is not particularly clear-cut either. In her article, Mistresses and Marriage, or A Short History of the Misses, Amy Louise Erickson explains, quote, the word mistress has a multi-layered history. Today, it generally refers either to a woman in an illicit sexual relationship, or, more rarely, to someone who is in perfect control of her art. Both the sexual connotation and the inference of mastery date back to at least the later Middle Ages.
So the term mistress has altered and evolved drastically since its initial use. For example, in Samuel Johnson's dictionary in 1773, he includes several different definitions of mistress.
So we have 1. A woman who governs, correlative to subject or to servant. 2. A woman who has something in possession. 3. A woman skilled in anything. 4. A woman teacher. 5. A woman beloved and courted. 6. A term of contemptuous address. 7. A whore, a concubine.
Yes, and so Austen uses the term mistress in almost all of these iterations. We don't need to go through all of them, but for example, we have the idea that you need to fetch his master and mistress home instantly, or kind of going with definition number 2, the idea of mistress of Pemberley, or that Fanny Price endeavors to show that she is the mistress of her room. We have Jane Fairfax, who is a mistress of music, so that mastery. We have Mrs. Goddard, who is the mistress of a school. And even that last definition, we have Admiral Crawford, who installs his mistress in his home. So Austen's out there using all of the different versions.
Mm-hmm. So the OED defines a mistress as, quote, a woman having control or authority, and then provides different contexts similar to Johnson. What we want to point out is that there is a certain amount of agency in this definition.
The idea of, having control or authority, that there's some power associated with that. Katie Peel, in her book, Readers and Mistresses, Kept Women in Victorian Literature, argues that in addition to divesting terms like mistress and kept woman from sexual stigma and moral judgment, this allows us to, quote, rethink it as a position of agency.
She goes on to explain that this also, quote, allows us to emphasize the agency and survival nature of the status. It is an act of inclusion and acknowledges the active ways most, if not all, women were disprivileged by 19th century political, socioeconomic, and cultural institutions.
So for the purposes of this episode, a mistress in the 18th and 19th century is a woman who is in a relatively long-term sexual and or romantic relationship with someone who is not their husband. This arrangement also implies financial support for the woman in return for her sexual availability.
So that's the definition we'll be working with, since this is a term that how you understood the meaning absolutely depended on the context of the sentence.
Yeah.
The context of what the person you were speaking with actually said, the whole sentence, that's sort of how you knew what they meant.
Yeah.
So now that we've established what Austen means by under his protection, we need to zoom out a bit and place that relationship in its broader context, because it was part of a much wider spectrum of sexual and economic relationships that women experienced.
And before we go further, it's worth noting that we are focusing here specifically on women's experiences in this system. Of course, sex work then as now was not limited by gender. but this is the slice of that history most relevant to Austen's world and to Mrs. Clay's situation.
We're also thinking about sex work in two overlapping ways, as labor and as a social and cultural phenomenon. That means we're not just talking about relationships, we're also talking about the ways in which money and intimacy were deeply intertwined.
And as Faramers de Boivola emphasizes in his book, The Origins of Sex, there is a lot of fluidity and overlap in women's experiences of sex work. Women's experiences did not fall into neat, fixed categories. So we're going to give some broad context for the spectrum before focusing specifically on the role of a mistress. And even within that specific focus, there's a lot of variability and nuance. So we will be speaking in a lot of generalities.
At one end of that spectrum, what we might call the most precarious end, were women working in brothels or on the streets, and women who engaged in occasional transactional sex as part of a broader strategy of survival.
As Penelope Corfield writes in her book, The Georgians, The Deeds and Misdeeds of 18th Century Britain, the 18th century saw, quote, a growing visibility of female prostitution as an urban service industry. And this is particularly expanding in cities like London.
And the demand was widespread. As Roy and Leslie Adkins point out in their work, Jane Austen's England, quote, men of all classes resorted to prostitutes, and they proliferated especially in urban centers and port towns.
One of the most famous artifacts of this culture is Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies, which was an annual publication running from 1757 to 1795, and it cataloged individual sex workers in London. So it was part directory, part entertainment, and part scandal literature. So the existence of this really tells us how prolific this was.
The economic reality for these women was generally stark. Their earnings were typically small and irregular, often measured in shillings rather than pounds, and their working conditions could be unstable and dangerous.
Many combined sex work with other forms of labor, domestic service, laundry, informal trades, and they moved in and out of the trade depending on necessity. Their lives were shaped by fluctuating income, physical risk, and limited options.
Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum were far more visible and powerful figures, royal mistresses and elite courtesans, women whose relationships with wealthy or influential men could bring them a degree of stability, publicity, and even influence.
As Corfield writes, sexual liaisons in high society were tacitly accepted. Royal mistresses were publicly known, as were those of many politicians, peers, and generals. So in other words, these relationships were not secrets so much as like open facts of what elite society looked like.
And in the Regency period, the tone was set from the very top. According to Venetia Murray in An Elegant Madness, High Society in Regency England, quote, the prince's example, and she's referring to the Prince Regent, aka Prinny here, the prince's example set the standards for society. His love affairs became the serial scandal of his generation. They began with his passion for Perdita, a lovely young actress, carried on through numerous mistresses, and included a clandestine and illegal marriage, that's in scare quotes, to Mrs. Fitzherbert.
Yeah, totally illegal marriage happening there. While these women remained outside of the institution of marriage, their proximity to authority made it really hard for society to shun them. So their roles placed them in a category distinct from most other women in similar relationships.
And crucially, it was a role that could sit quite comfortably within elite expectations. Lucy Worsley, in her book, The Courtiers, Splendor and Intrigue in the Georgian Court at Kensington Palace, describes how Henrietta Howard's relationship with the future George II was viewed at court as, quote, acceptable, almost respectable. It would indeed have been more scandalous for the prince to have remained faithful to his wife.
Worsley even goes on to say that Princess Caroline, George II's wife, was, quote, not to put out with this relationship. So it gave her a certain amount of freedom as well.
So a royal mistress was not simply a private companion, but a public figure. Her relationship is simultaneously personal, economic, and political.
And next to the royal mistress in public profile and popularity were the elite courtesans. These women occupied a similarly visible but more ambiguous position within what is often called the demi-monde. So that's the social sphere that overlapped with the beau monde. We're getting our French influence here. So that high society. But this is kind of where they remain on the margins based on these kind of moral perceptions. And demi-monde here is a French word for half world. So they're half in that high society, half out.
Courtesans were in a position that combined dependence on patrons with a notable, if limited, degree of agency. In her article, New Feminist Approaches to 18th Century Women's Labor, Sex Work and Mother Work, in the Memoirs of Mrs. Margaret Leeson, 1795 to 1797, Alexandra Collinson explains that some courtesans were able to choose their lovers, quote, on the basis of love or affection, or at the very least, sexual attraction.
This means that these women had a certain amount of leverage and negotiation power when it came to choosing their patrons and their conditions. Katie Hickman explains in her book, Courtesans, Money, Sex, and Fame in the 19th Century, that in these proposed relationships, it had become, quote, a common practice for a man to make a formal financial offer, legal documents drawn up and witnessed by lawyers.
Courtesans might receive competing proposals, each with its own terms, conditions, and expectations. Even when such arrangements remained informal, men effectively bid for their favor, and women could refuse, negotiate, or delay.
One example that shows this negotiating power is demonstrated by Harriet Wilson, who was one of the more famous courtesans of the Regency era. According to Murray, quote, it was said of her that she changed her lovers as easily as her shoes, and that she always went straight to the point on hearing of a potential customer, saying that a £50 note will do as easily as an introduction. This was a hefty sum at the time, and one which only guaranteed that she was prepared to listen to a proposition. The terms of the contract could be negotiated later.
I mean, boss, like...
Get your bag,
Yeah. Yeah. Harriet Wilson is like, you want to talk to me? That will be £50, please and thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And as Robert Morrison notes in his book, The Regency Years, successful courtesans enjoyed many of the same privileges as aristocratic wives, including a furnished home, a generous income, a lavish wardrobe, and a raft of servants.
With that said, their access to elite society was limited. Morrison continues, saying, they were able to circulate only in spaces that were either open to the public or exclusively male, and not at all in those designated for respectable ladies or society entertainments.
They moved instead through spaces on the edges of society, in carriages in Hyde Park, at Vauxhall, in the opera and the theater.
Part of what makes this group of workers, these women, so visible to us today is that they were also unusually well documented. Courtesans frequently became the subjects or authors of biographies and memoirs, a genre that flourished in the 18th century and into the 19th. These accounts drew on intense public fascination and could serve multiple purposes, could extend a woman's career, could shape her reputation, or even exert pressure on formal patrons.
And just a few examples of these memoirs. The memoirs of the celebrated Miss Fanny Murray, 1750s, the memoirs of Mrs. Margaret Leeson, which we already mentioned, and the memoirs of Harriet Wilson, 1825. Clearly, there was an appetite for these in publishing at this time.
Yeah, this is a small sampling of the available information. So it's always interesting to kind of get their perception on it. It's very important and valid to get their perception on this work. And so we have a couple of quotes from some of these memoirs. The first one is coming from a memoir about Sophia Baddeley. And she said, the young gentleman, I believe, loves me to adoration, but I will not be his wife notwithstanding, nor will I be the wife of any man, for I can never submit to the control of a husband or put it in his power to say that I have been imprudent in life. So again, you're seeing that kind of the power and autonomy that's going into her decision here. And then this next one is from Harriet Wilson. I will be the mere instrument of pleasure to no man. So again, there is an amount of power and choice that these women have, which is it's powerful to hear in their own voice.
Yeah. And it's also important to note, obviously, with these women that while these women certainly did have more power and agency than sex workers on the lower end of the spectrum, they are still in a precarious position in the sense that they're sort of dependent on their youth, their looks, right? Many of these women, despite having a certain amount of fame and wealth in their younger years, did not necessarily end their lives in great circumstances.
Yeah. Some of them were publishing their memoirs as a way to gain finances because they were hard up. So yeah.
So at the top of the spectrum, we see relationships that are highly visible, sometimes openly negotiated, and in certain cases, relatively stable. Again,
all relative, yes.
There isn't necessarily like that long-term guarantee, but within this world, right, these women are in a fairly good position. And at the bottom end of the spectrum, we have the highly precarious and socially marginalized sex work, often performed in poverty or for survival.
But there were many women who existed somewhere in the middle. And these women, these mistresses and kept or protected women, those are the ones we want to focus on because that helps us understand Mrs. Clay's position a bit better.
Relationships between mistresses and their patrons were generally more private than the public affairs we've just been describing. As a result, we don't have the same kind of visibility or documentation as we do for royal mistresses or famous courtesans. So what we're working with here are broad patterns and a few detailed case studies. And while every relationship would have been different, these sources do allow us to sketch out the general contours of what mistresshood might have looked like.
So the Atkins explain that, quote, mistresses were kept mainly by married and unmarried men of the upper class and gentry who could afford the cost. So this is a very common experience, and it's also an inherently economic one. And yet mistresshood occupied a very ambiguous social position.
On the one hand, as Murray points out, by the Regency period, quote, the role of the mistress acquired a cachet which was positively respectable, particularly among the upper classes. Women such as Emma Hamilton, in her relationship with Lord Nelson, occupied this space, receiving houses, financial support, and a degree of social recognition within certain circles.
In part, this was shaped by the behavior of the royal and aristocratic men whose long-term relationships made mistresshood visible, and in certain contexts, even socially tolerable. Because it's a really bad idea to shun the king's mistress if you want to hang out in high society.
But that tolerance had limits. Rory Muir, in his book, Love and Marriage in the Age of Jane Austen, writes, mistresses were a fact of life, a reality, but they were not respectable and would not normally be acknowledged by a woman who cared for her reputation.
Most mistresses were in positions that were more discreet and often dependent on their ability to maintain social ambiguity or a low profile. A mistress might enjoy comfort and proximity to elite life as part of the demi-monde, but often at the cost of broader moral judgment and social respectability.
Kate Gibson explains in her article, Extramarital Love in 18th Century England, that entering into this kind of arrangement could come at a real cost. The loss of respectability through an extramarital relationship further limited women's economic independence by damaging their chances of employment in service or as a governess, and could even lead to estrangement from family and community.
In practical terms, many mistresses lived in arrangements that resembled a kind of unofficial partnership. Most patrons paid for their mistresses' lodgings and domestic requirements, and in return, these women cultivated a quasi-domestic relationship for their patrons, and that generally centered on sexual availability.
In some cases, the relationship came to resemble what was effectively a second private household. We can see this in the kinds of relationships described in Gibson's article, in which she examines the surviving set of letters of a woman known only as E.B., writing to her lover, the second Earl of Tyrconnell. Gibson explains that E.B. writes with a desire for permanence and a shared life, writing, "It is my wish that I could be your partner for life."
And this affectionate relationship could be part of the appeal for this arrangement. Muir explains that for many men, a mistress offered, quote, something more than sex, companionship and domestic comfort, even love. In a society where marriage was often shaped by property, inheritance, family expectations, etc., a mistress could provide a space for intimacy that marriage itself didn't always allow.
But that domesticity was shaped by the economic structure of the relationship. In her article, You Know I Am All on Fire, Writing the Adulterous Affair in England, circa 1740 to 1830, Sally Holloway, a former guest, points out that in long-term affairs, the content of correspondence was often dominated by the practicalities of maintaining a household.
In one specific example, Anna Maria Bennett, who was a long-standing mistress to Admiral Thomas Pye, often wrote letters to him that included updates about their children, but were also dominated with requests for money or accounting for household expenses.
Holloway writes, in February 1781, Anna Maria sent him a bill for £21, 5 shillings, 8 pence spent on damask, £5, 18 shillings spent on a tailor, and £3, 5 shillings to pay the maid. In 1783, she sent Thomas a 3-page breakdown of her expenses based on her memorandums and receipts, excluding only the little things which had slipped my memory.
Holloway goes on to explain that the assembly and cost of particular objects provided a dominant trope of letters in long-term affairs. The content of her letters, referring to Anna Maria, were directly shaped by the realities of life as a kept woman, and that they read as invoices as much as love letters.
At the same time, the role could offer certain freedoms for mistress that were not easily available to wives. As Murray notes, a successful mistress could sometimes have, quote, a lot more fun than a wife and a much better financial deal since she was free to control her own money.
But this freedom existed alongside significant constraints. One of the clearest ways we see this is in expectations of availability. As Hickman describes in the case of Sophia Baddeley, who as a courtesan occupied a slightly different social position, she still operated under a similar dynamic.
Once attached to a patron, quote, she had to be available to Lord Melbourne whenever he wanted her. He had the run of Sophia's house and had the habit of coming in at inconvenient moments. Whatever Sophia was doing, taking tea or playing at cards, he could interrupt her at will and ask her to retire with him. Again, scare quotes. Scare quotes really coming in handy in this episode.
Yes. So let's talk a bit more about the specifics of these kinds of relationships in terms of contracts and money. Because however these relationships were framed, whether as love, companionship, or convenience, they were also shaped by very real economic arrangements.
But as Muir points out, quote, the financial side of such relationships is usually obscure, and arrangements could vary widely depending on the individuals involved, their social status, their resources, and their negotiating power. But we do have enough evidence to sketch out a range of possible structures.
At one end of the economic scale were relatively modest arrangements. In the 1760s and 1770s, for example, Lord Cunningham's attorney drew up formal legal agreements with Elizabeth Bulstrode, who was also Cunningham's housekeeper, conflict of interest, who received an annuity of £26 per year, and then with Mary Perfect, a clergyman's daughter, who was to receive £100 a year alongside the promise of £2,000 upon his death, provided she met certain conditions.
These two examples are revealing since they show how closely financial arrangements could be tied to a woman's class or background and the perceived value, again, the scare quotes, of the relationship. So clergyman's daughter?
Worth more than a housekeeper, essentially.
Again, we don't like to say that, but that's
how he perceived that relationship.
That is how he would have perceived it, yes.
And at the other end of this economic scale, the sums could be much larger. Murray gives us an example. When the actress, Mrs. Jordan, began her relationship with the Duke of Clarence, her terms reportedly included £1,200 a year, an equipage, and provisions for her children. And then he ended up paying her 200 guineas every quarter for the next 20 years.
These arrangements were also sometimes more formal than we might expect. Hickman explains, by the 18th century, when establishing a courtesan as a mistress, quote, it was a common practice for a man to make a formal financial offer, together with any other terms and conditions the couple might mutually agree on. These were legal documents drawn up and witnessed by lawyers.
So we see this very explicitly in some cases. One of Sophia Baddeley's early suitors, for example, arrived with his attorney and the deeds of a settlement already prepared, treating the relationship quite literally as a contractual agreement. She did turn him away, but he's like, I'm ready for you to sign.
In other situations, the etiquette for setting up a mistress was a little more covert. Murray writes that sometimes this meant that, quote, while the principals confined themselves to talk of love, friends were employed to negotiate the terms rather in the role of seconds in a duel. She points to an example where one of Earl Grey's grandsons had his friend, Captain Greenough, broker a deal with an opera dancer he was interested in. And for those who are similarly interested, the deal was £2,000 a year and £800 down for as long as she stayed with him.
So with courtesans and high-end mistresses, they have a little bit more negotiation power. They often operated in a more overtly competitive environment where multiple patrons might make simultaneous offers. So, as an example, Hickman describes a series of competing proposals made to Sophia Baddeley. $400 a year was an offer from one admirer. $600 a year and marriage was another offer. And from the Duke of Northumberland, £1,000 upfront plus 500 annually for life. She still turned it down and stayed with Lord Melbourne. So she was, she was negotiating from a place of power.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and the 600-year in marriage is very interesting, right? Because then you're moving into completely different territory, socially speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And that did sometimes happen,
Yes,
but
definitely. But it definitely legitimizes the relationship, even though her past would have still been public. It would have been like, no, we've formalized this. And
yeah. And we're not going to go into that a lot in this episode, but in a case where a woman was sort of a known mistress and then the couple married, she might not have had like still the easiest time in society, especially with other, quote unquote, respectable women.
Uh-huh.
So marriage, it doesn't sort of like fix everything, but it certainly does provide more security and security for any children that might come as a result of the relationship. And then in the case of like somebody like Mrs. Clay, if she's really clever about it and is hoping to become Lady Elliot, she's not going to be like going out with him publicly to the theater, right? She would be doing her best to sort of like
keep a low profile.
Exactly. And it might still get around. And obviously in her case, it does get around. We know that people are talking about their relationship because of the way Austen phrases it, being next heard of as established under his protection. So we know the gossip is already there.
Yeah.
But if she's careful, she's not going to flaunt the relationship publicly, going to public places where she's going to be seen by the general public in the company of this man that she's not married to, where again, the gossip will just spread more and more.
Yeah.
So she's going to be keeping a low profile.
She really wants that domestic space to be where they hang out.
If her eventual goal is Lady Elliot and the social prestige that comes with that, she'll keep it pretty low-key and just hope that, with time and, once she's eventually achieved that status, that the gossip will just sort of fade. I mean, I know we've said this so many times in this episode, but again, so many sort of levels, so many like shades, so many gradations with all of this.
Every relationship is unique.
Yes. So the more likely scenario for a mistress would be a woman who was tied to a single patron, and therefore she lacked that same degree of negotiating leverage. Arrangements could still be structured, but they were typically less competitive and less transparent, and therefore less secure.
So whether formal documents were drawn up or not, these relationships often functioned as if they were contracts. And these arrangements were almost always full of conditions for the woman in the scenario. I mean, we're all shocked by that. So in the case of Mary Perfect and her agreement with Lord Cunningham,
and as a reminder, she was the clergyman's daughter.
She's the clergyman's daughter, yes. He would allow her financial support as long as she, quote, continued to live with him until his death, not marry anyone without his consent, and did not alienate or dispose of the bond. So those were the conditions. She did end up bowing out of the relationship. She did choose to get married, but like there was this kind of overt and long set of things that she could have only if she lived up to these conditions.
Well, and interesting that he's like not marry anyone without his consent. So it's like, okay, so she marries somebody with his consent, and part of the arrangement is that
that they can continue on.
Yeah,
he's a gem. He's a gem.
Interesting. So this leads us to the question of what happens when the arrangement ends. Because we cannot say it enough, financial security for mistresses at all levels was precarious. So the man controlled the resources. He could set the terms. And ultimately, he had more power about how and when to end the arrangement.
Muir emphasizes this when he says a mistress could, quote, be dismissed at any time and had nothing to claim by right. So even decades of a shared life could be undone abruptly, as in the well-known case of Mrs. Jordan, who after years with the future William IV and after bearing his children was ultimately abandoned. So nothing is 100% secure here.
When these arrangements ended, there was no standard outcome. In a best-case scenario, women could be pensioned off with annuities or settlements designed to support themselves after the affair ended. But these outcomes were not guaranteed, and even when provisions were made, they could be conditional, contested, or insufficient. Some mistresses were dismissed abruptly with nothing at all.
And remember that many of these women also had no legal claims or contracts to enforce agreements if the man chose not to honor them. And even if they did have a contract, I mean, oftentimes, again, during this time period, unfortunately, the law didn't consider women's right as on the same footing as a man's. So they had less mechanisms to enforce a contract.
The patron's finances also factored into the equation of how to end an arrangement. As Muir explains, quote, most men could not afford to pension off an ex-mistress on a generous scale, even if they wanted to. So these men would often, quote, get rid of an unwanted lover by passing her on to another man with more or less subtlety and tact.
The tenuous nature of these arrangements get even more complicated when we consider what happened when these relationships extended beyond the couple themselves. Because one of the most significant and highly likely consequences of these arrangements was the presence of children.
Not every mistress had children, of course, but for those who did, motherhood introduced a new set of pressures into the equation. As Collinson points out, quote, despite maternity being both a motivation for prostitution and its occupational hazard, prostitution and mothering were not defined as work in the 18th century and were attributed to separate patriarchal classifications of womanhood.
In other words, mistresshood and motherhood often pulled in opposite directions. This meant that these mothers had to make difficult decisions about how to care for their children.
Some women negotiated support for pre-existing children with their patrons, as Collinson explains. And in other situations, as she goes on to write, quote, some mistresses secured annuity payments from their keepers to support children after separation. Others kept their children secret from new keepers, settling them with nurses or families for a weekly remittance.
And in some cases, women made what Gibson describes as a calculated decision to improve their children's status by separating themselves from their children so that they wouldn't be judged by society for their mother's choices. We're not saying that's okay, but we're saying that that was the social situation.
As we discussed in our episode on Harriet Smith as a natural daughter, there were a lot of different arrangements that could be made for illegitimate children. Men technically had a financial responsibility to support their illegitimate children, but this was often hard to enforce since the mothers generally had no legal claim on the fathers.
And while we don't know any details about Harriet's mother, it is possible she was a mistress and therefore had to make these kinds of decisions about how best to help her illegitimate daughter navigate society without the attached stigma of her mother, which is obviously wildly unfair to women in these scenarios. But again, those are the social realities.
So motherhood inherently intensifies the economic stakes of these relationships. As Collinson notes, memoirs from women like Margaret Coughlin, Margaret Leeson, and other sex workers from this time period provide a better understanding of the, quote, messy socioeconomic reality of mothering beyond a traditional family unit in ways that counteract one-dimensional visions of sex workers' maternal failures. And many times the choices for these women are quite limited.
Very narrow, yeah.
And oftentimes that choice is keep your children but ruin their reputation and their future, or try to preserve that reputation and future for them but never see them again.
Mm-hmm. And neither of those are solid options. So this complicated view of maternal figures as mistresses brings us back finally to Persuasion and Mrs. Clay, because we are introduced to Penelope Clay in the novel when Austen tells us that she has returned to her father's home, quote, after an unprosperous marriage with the additional burden of 2 children.
We never really see or hear about these children again, but it is possible that these children are being cared for either by Mrs. Clay's family, a paid nanny, or a boarding school, during the course of the novel. It's unclear what would happen with her children's care after she comes under Mr. Elliot's protection. But we've hopefully laid out, some of the possibilities here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that really kind of brings us to this long passage at the top of the episode because there is a ton of detail to unpack here. Mrs. Clay is making a really interesting choice here at the end. She has spent the entire novel positioning herself very deliberately within the Elliot household. Austen tells us outright that she is, quote, a clever young woman who understood the art of pleasing. I mean, Austen doesn't give those descriptors for nothing. She's very much so embedding that. And we see that play out very strategically with her ingratiating herself specifically with Sir Walter throughout the novel.
And it's working. We see this shift in subtle ways throughout the novel, but one specific example is when we learn that Mrs. Clay has freckles and Sir Walter can't stand freckles. It's a whole thing with him. And then near the end of the novel, Sir Walter tells Anne that Mrs. Clay has been using Galvin's lotion and, quote, you see how it has carried away her freckles. And for more on that, we do have an episode on Galvin's lotion.
Yes. Well, and then after he's been they're gone, Austen delivers this beautiful line. It did not appear to Anne that the freckles were at all lessened. She's like, no, that's not what's happening here. So that Sir Walter is dazzled. He is charmed.
By the middle of the novel, the people around him, Anne, Lady Russell, Mr. Elliot, are genuinely alarmed that this woman might become Lady Elliot. Like, she is really working her magic here.
And then she pivots and becomes Mr. Elliot's mistress. It's such a bold and unexpected move, right? She's essentially giving up the potential for a legitimate marriage, a title, long-term security, and social elevation for this private arrangement that likely comes with social exclusion, economic dependence, and a very uncertain future. I mean, Austen even leaves that future open.
Yeah. And Austen gives us that line, right? Mrs. Clay's affections had overpowered her interest, that word interest, and she had sacrificed for the young man's sake the possibility of scheming longer for Sir Walter. So, like, the use of the words interest and sacrificed is sort of implying that she did sort of do this a little bit for love, right? Like, it wasn't just, yes, she's scheming, but it does appear that there's an emotional component here, right?
Yeah, there's something that's kind of jumping over logic. Yeah. Yeah.
So we come to realize that she and Mr. Elliot have been navigating a rather intricate game in the background. He's paying attention to her. You know, he doesn't want her to marry Sir Walter, so he's willing to flirt with her to divert.
Flirt to divert. That just sounds
flirt
fun.
to divert. While ostensibly courting one or both of the Elliot daughters. Like, I think he's given Elizabeth just enough that she's kind of like, okay, like, you know, hope springs eternal.
Right.
But, like, I think anybody who really can see clearly knows that it's Anne that he's interested in. And on the other hand, Mrs. Clay has also played a double game. She's flirting with both Sir Walter and his heir apparent. I mean, these two are just a match made in heaven. I love it so much. Like, I'm like, you two are perfect for each other.
And it's so subtle, right? And so, like, but, you know, it's like in hindsight, it's one of those, again, where you're like, you read the novel again and you're like, oh, that was the breadcrumb. So, like, we see a little bit of that double game when Mrs. Clay offers to walk home in the rain with Mr. Elliot when they're at Mullins. Right, where she's like, no, my boots are so much thicker than Anne's.
Oh, I'll be totally fine. I swear. I mean, I don't need to ride in the carriage.
And, like, again, in hindsight, you're like, oh, she definitely wants to spend time with him so that she can do her, you know, play her game to kind of get in good with him.
Yeah. Or she's genuinely sort of like crushing on him. You know, like it's so fluid. Like, their relationship is so fluid because they are sort of like manipulating each other.
Yes.
But again, the use of that word sacrifice, right? And like sacrificing her interests for the young man's sake. There's a lot going on here, right?
So much going on. It's fabulous. Austen just delivering nuance with just gradients.
Yep. Ultimately, Mrs. Clay chooses Mr. Elliot. Again, sacrificing her interests. We cannot say that enough, right? It wasn't like the situation with Sir Walter was looking like an unlikely, you know, it wasn't looking like an unlikely possibility. It seemed like she could have closed that deal if she had wanted to.
Yeah, she's got like the three most intelligent observers of the situation being like, no, this is, Sir Walter is in a danger zone.
Yeah. And, you know, at least some part of that makes sense. In her article, Love Comes to Penelope Clay, Elizabeth Newark writes, she has a chance of becoming Lady Elliot and reigning at Kellynch Hall. To persuade her to throw this away, what must Mr. Elliot have promised her? Jewels, clothes, a carriage, and a house complete with servants? But these would have all come with Sir Walter in a socially acceptable form. The difference must be in the man.
So a couple of possibilities that we need to talk through here. The first is that Mr. Elliot is irresistible, especially if he looks like Henry Golding. I just need to put that in here, right? So he's technically, you know, if again, even reading from the book, he's younger, he's likely hotter, he's definitely wealthier. And probably more interesting to talk to than Sir Walter. I mean, he does have some charisma going on here.
Yeah. And that does beg the question, do we need to add Mr. Elliot to the Edmund Bertram category of like bewilderingly hot guy that makes somebody like a Mary Crawford think, you know, the older brother is going to inherit the title, but the younger brother is irresistible. Like, I just, you know.
So good looking.
He's just so hot. Because it really is a very curious choice on her part. I mean, especially for being really mercenary, like.
Yeah. It's wild. Yeah. So another potential angle is that Mrs. Clay may have given up on Sir Walter to play a longer game and obviously potentially marrying Mr. Elliot. As Geoffrey Nigro and William Phillips speculate in their article, Jane Austen, Madame de Staël, and the Seductiveness of Conversation, in the meantime, Mrs. Clay will have a lot more fun, hanging out with someone who has both more sense and more money than the current baronet. Even if the Lady Elliot ploy doesn't work out, it seems unlikely that Mrs. Clay will exit Mr. Elliot's protection empty-handed. So again, he is more wealthy. This does have that upside right up front.
But that is a choice that comes with a lot of risk.
Mm-hmm.
It is a gamble.
Mm-hmm.
He's potentially the better long-term investment, especially if she can close the deal.
Yeah, exactly.
And get him to marry her. Because Sir Walter has a respectability in the title, but as we know, he's not exactly rolling in the dough. And we also know that her first marriage was quote-unquote unprosperous, which sort of implies she wasn't left well off as a widow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we were to sort of think she is making a rational decision, like it sort of seems irrational. Like why would you give up the secure, like the socially acceptable marriage? And I think if Sir Walter was equally wealthy, it really would be sort of like
a super head scratcher. We would not be able to.
It really would be like, wow, Mr. Elliot must just, like.
You have never seen a more attractive man on this planet.
But I think because of the fact that Sir Walter is not wealthy, it kind of balances the playing field a little bit, but it's still very risky for her, especially when you consider she could become pregnant. There's a lot of factors at play here. So yeah, she's taking a risk. And I don't know, to me, it feels like it's possibly a calculated gamble, but I think the thing that has to be pushing it over the edge is that there is some kind of emotional component. That she's sacrificing her interest for the sake of the young man, and whether it seems like it must be a little bit genuine on her part. We must hope that it's also a little bit genuine on his part.
Yeah.
She's not being completely played in this situation, but Austen sort of leaves it to our imagination. As she says, it is now a doubtful point whether his cunning or hers may finally carry the day. Either way, it appears to be this very interesting mix of this cunning and also attraction.
Yeah. I do think another kind of fascinating component here is because we've talked about the economics of these kinds of decisions too, in terms of like, what's the contract going to look like? Because I think she's in such a strong negotiating position
oh, for sure.
to go into this kind of conversation. Because again, it's not on lock that she will get Sir Walter, but it's at least a very real possibility. So for her to be able to say, I'm willing to let that go, she's in a stronger bargaining position than a lot of women could possibly be in.
And if she's smart, and I think she is, she's going to ask for quite a bit upfront,
Yes.
And if she's really, really smart, she's going to be like, and I would like that house to be in my name,
Yes.
like.
She's like, I need the contracts. I need my children to be taken care of. I need, she's going to have a list. And again, he's got the money to live up to that. And I think, again, she's in a fairly unique negotiating position, which is interesting.
What we wouldn't give to see that contract.
Right? I am very curious. So you've been talking also about the fact that there's probably something in Mrs. Clay's perspective that says that she's interested in him. Newark proposes that there's also the angle that Mr. Elliot is probably making this offer of protection. This is Austen's words, for his own interest and his own enjoyment. So Newark proposes that this idea of enjoyment indicates that he at least finds her attractive. And then, again, the fact that Mrs. Clay's affections are also probably involved in this. So again, it might be mutual, but I think Newark's reading that there's a certain amount of him being like, okay, I would at least enjoy, whether it's enjoying her as a person and a personality, or at least, I don't know, a more cynical reading is that he will enjoy pulling that rug out from under Sir Walter.
So Austen really purposely avoids resolving this particular relationship. It feels like the ambiguity of Mrs. Clay's decisions. Again, we don't know. Like Austen tells us her affections had overpowered her interest, which sort of implies that she's in love with Mr. Elliot, and that's why she's making these decisions. But Austen also tells us that she's sort of like, well, we'll see if I can convince him to make me Lady Elliot. So she's clearly not. She's not giving up on that idea either.
And she's like, this woman is clever. This woman has abilities. I love that sentence.
She might be in love, but she's still savvy. Yeah, it feels like the ambiguity of Mrs. Clay's decisions, they match the kind of ambiguous role that mistresses played in this society, especially mistresses at this kind of level, right? They're not the public courtesans. They're not the ones that are going to be writing the best-selling memoir that everyone's going to want to read.
Yeah.
And Austen doesn't seem to judge her for these choices either. If anything, she seems kind of amused of the power that Mrs. Clay is wielding through this novel, and that even at the end, where she does, her affections overpower her interests. And even when she does that, Austen's like, okay, she does that, but Mrs. Clay is not giving up. We obviously can't say for absolute certain, but something about the word choice of wheedled and caressed at last It feels like Austen might be leaning towards Mrs. Clay's eventual success here in terms of getting to the altar. Either way, Mrs. Clay is not going to quit trying.
Yeah. Again, just the phrasing of this this passage is like we talked about, like the fact that it moves to the present tense. And again, she has ability, however, as well as affections, and it is now a doubtful point whether his cunning or hers may finally carry the day. It's so good.
It's sort of this picture of like they are two adversaries, sort of, it's a real enemies to lovers kind of situation.
Yes. And they're both matched in cunning, in strategy, in charm.
It's really like you're getting this idea of two fencers, right? And like how is this going to play out between the two of them?
Yeah.
And what is their relationship going to be like? Because they're either extremely well matched and are going to be so happy together, or it's going to implode and, it feels like there's not really an in-between there.
Yeah. Well, and then in the most recent Persuasion adaptation, they riff entirely on this.
Oh, yeah.
And they actually have them at the altar at the end of that, which again, it's a really interesting way to kind of close a novel that leaves it open. Of course, I'm going to prefer Austen's version purely because it does leave all of the questions unanswered, and I love that. But it is, it's at least a possibility for sure. And I do love kind of as to kind of close out the conversation on Mrs. Clay, at least, to kind of speculate about what happens if she does end up marrying Mr. Elliot, and to kind of sum up the kind of chaos that would ensue if this were to happen. We have Margie Burns in her article, Comic Resolution, Humorous Loose Ends in Austen's Novel, and she lays out this scenario to perfection.
Quote, any ceremonial family gathering will bring the pleasure of seeing the future Mrs. Elliot and possibly her neglected children to Elizabeth Elliot, whom Elliot seemed to pursue, as Mrs. Clay insisted, and to Anne, whom he actually pursued. While Sir Walter lives, any such gathering will bring him together with a man who took Mrs. Clay from him, who took him from Mrs. Clay, and who disappointed one daughter and imposed on another.
Family dinners are going to be awesome.
Yeah. Do not go to Thanksgiving at that house. My goodness. Yeah.
Or to be a fly on the wall at that Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like the other thing that's, again, like if you're really getting into speculation, is sort of how long Sir Walter lives. Like, does that also impact her negotiating power, right? Like, does she have more or less power when she's negotiating to become Mrs. Elliot? And like, if they're still not married and then Sir Walter dies, like now does he have more negotiating?
Yes. Yeah.
It's really, there's just so many moving pieces. These two are playing three-dimensional chess. This is like max game theory, and we are here for it.
Yeah. We need to talk more about how clever Mrs. Clay is, honestly. I think she is fascinating.
Yeah, she's doing the most work behind the scenes in this novel, for sure. So we want to talk a little bit about where else mistresses, of the way that we are defining it in this episode, comes up in Austen's works. So in Mansfield Park, we get an overt reference to mistresses, again, in the context that we've been discussing. And this is when we are first learning about the Crawfords. Austen writes, Admiral Crawford was a man of vicious conduct who chose, instead of retaining his niece, to bring his mistress under his own roof. And that is the impetus for Mary Crawford to move in with Mrs. Grant early in the novel because, as a respectable lady of marriageable age who's hoping to make a good match, she cannot live in the same household as a known mistress.
Right. And that's, again, he's not a good guy. Austen makes that very clear. And this is an appalling choice that he has made, specifically because it interferes with Mary Crawford's security. So Erin Spampanato, in her article, Tom Became What He Ought to Be, Mansfield Park as Homosocial Bildungsroman, points out that Mary is forced to leave since, quote, as an unmarried woman, she will be tainted by living with the Admiral's mistress. Again, that's the social construct of the day.
Muir also writes, quote, a man might boast of his mistress to his male friends and even introduce them to her, but he would not think of expecting his mother or sister to meet her, or in this case, his niece.
Live with his niece.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's unusual in that particular regard. And so he's definitely like spitting in the face of society by doing this. But not only is that not typical behavior, but this is also happening only a few months after his wife has died. And then he specifically chooses his mistress over his niece. He does not care. He is a gem.
Yeah. And let us not forget that Henry Crawford really admires his uncle. Like, he really looks up to him.
I wonder where he gets it, you know?
We're just going to put a pin in that. Just think about that, you guys. So then in Pride and Prejudice, we see the very real possibility of a mistress situation for Lydia when she elopes with Wickham and then the family learns that no marriage has actually happened. And of course, in this case, this would be a scenario where she maybe doesn't realize that that is what is happening, but essentially that is what is happening.
Right. And so without that marriage, Lydia is essentially a kept woman. But her family and Mr. Darcy go through a lot of trouble and spend a lot of money to track her down and then essentially force Wickham to marry her.
Muir observes that they do so, quote, despite knowing that he was a rogue and that he would certainly be an indifferent husband.
And that's generous, honestly.
I don't think anybody has any illusions that Wickham is going to be like a really great partner in life.
Yeah.
All of this demonstrates the real fear of what it would mean for Lydia socially, financially, etc., if she doesn't get the legal protection of marriage, something her family and Darcy is well aware of.
Yeah.
The fact that they're like, yeah, he's not a great guy, but you have to marry him is really speaking to the social context of this time.
Yeah, the consequences are very real for her. And there is a fear for the whole family's reputation as well. That's very clear. And Lady Catherine de Bourgh has no problem throwing that in Lizzie's face later on. But that's how brutal society could be to these women, these mistresses. So the Bennets would prefer having to deal with Wickham as a part of their family forever, despite the fact that they know he is a predator, despite knowing that he's deceitful. It's safer to have her married to him than have her not married to him.
And not only for Lydia's reputation, but also for their own reputation.
Yes. For the unmarried daughters.
If Lydia is known to be someone's mistress, they are all ruined.
Yeah. Again, wildly unfair.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfair to Lydia, full stop, but then it's also unfair that in the social context, that they would also be sort of all lumped together. Like,
yeah. In today's society, I think all of us would be like, nope, you don't want to hitch your wagon to that even remotely.
Run far, far away.
Yes. And so it always needs to be put into that larger context of that's they are afraid for Lydia in that context.
So in Sense and Sensibility, we have the example of the first Eliza, who ends up in a sponging house for debtors, but it is also implied that she might have been someone's mistress. She was divorced, which means there had to be evidence of adultery for a crim con case.
Again, this may have been initially more of an affair situation versus like a paid mistress situation where there's a clear understanding. But it seems like at some point after her divorce, she may have been supported by this first seducer. Regardless, however, her ending shows the possible social and financial consequences for women who strayed from what society deemed appropriate for a woman's sexual behavior. Again, we'll say it again and again and again. It's not fair.
And then a reference from Austen's own life. According to Muir, quote, Jane Austen noted that her cousin Eliza had met Lord Craven and, quote, found his manners very pleasing indeed. The little flaw of having a mistress now living with him at Ashdown Park seems to be the only unpleasing circumstance about him. So we've got a little bit of an Admiral Crawford situation going on here.
Yeah. Austen was pulling for mill life.
Well, that is our episode on mistresses.
Thank you for coming on this marathon journey.
I think it's our longest episode ever. We covered a lot. We've had requests from people to cover Mrs. Clay, to cover, mistresses during this time period, the full range of sex work during this time period. And so, we were like, do we do separate episodes? But it's all so tied together that we're like, we're doing the mega episode. So if you have any thoughts for us, you can find us on our website, thethingaboutausten.com, and email us at thethingaboutausten@gmail.com. And if you would like to support the podcast, you can head to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/thethingaboutausten. And we so appreciate everyone who signed up for our Patreon. And we also always appreciate the support that comes from a 5-star Apple Podcast review. So if you're not in a position to support us on Patreon and you haven't done a Apple Podcast review, we appreciate them so much.
They're a very meaningful contribution. We do appreciate them.
So this week, we want to shout out Daughter of Bob, who calls us the Pemberley podcast and says that they look forward to every smart, fun, rewarding deep dive into the particulars of my favorite lady author. And also to Elmsell, who says that we are always interesting and that they look forward to every episode. So thank you so much to those reviewers and to everybody who has reviewed us. And again, a huge, huge shout out to everyone who has signed up for our Patreon. It's been a stunning response. We truly appreciate it. As the Brits say, we are both completely chuffed.
Yes. Stay tuned for next episode when we'll be talking about sea bathing.
Thanks for listening. Bye.